Hello, my dear friends. A noblewoman kills her husband but is called a model widow. A child goes missing from school without being questioned. A maid finds a body but is forced to sign a pledge of silence. You thought Victorian times were all tutus and tea parties. You're probably only looking at the half mirror. Buried secrets, shrieks swallowed into the darkness, and pages of history never to be printed are waiting to be revealed. Tonight, we'll slip past the velvet curtains and uncover what history tried to forget. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one entered a Victorian home, the first impression was often the decoration. Walls were covered with colourful wallpaper, curtains hung heavy with printed designs, and dresses shone in bright shades. The colours looked rich and full of life. Families took pride in these details because they showed taste and status. Many of those colours came from arsenic, a substance that was cheap, easy to produce, and gave fabrics and paper a glow that people admired. It became part of the daily surroundings without anyone asking too many questions about its safety. Arsenic dyes such as Shields green and Paris green were popular choices. They were used in wallpapers, carpets, clothing, and even artificial flowers. A parlour lined with green wallpaper looked modern, and a woman in a green gown stood out in a crowd. Shops promoted these items, and buyers trusted them. The idea that something so beautiful could be dangerous was not considered. What people wanted was brightness and novelty, and arsenic delivered both. Illness often followed quietly. People who spent long hours inside rooms decorated with arsenic wallpaper developed skin problems. Rashes, sores, and irritation appeared first. Hair began to fall, nails became brittle, and headaches grew worse. Some suffered from severe stomach pains and seizures. Death sometimes came after days of unexplained sickness. Doctors rarely blamed the walls or clothes. They spoke of bad air, weak constitutions, or ordinary disease. Families lived and died without realizing that the danger was already in their homes. The spread of arsenic was not limited to the wealthy. Even modest households saved money to purchase a roll of brightly coloured paper or a dress dyed in fashionable tones. Arsenic made its way into the homes of both the rich and the poor. The poison did not discriminate. A girl in a simple bedroom decorated with cheap paper was exposed as surely as a lady in a grand drawing room filled with expensive fabrics. What united them was the desire for decoration that matched the trends of the time. Shops sold powders that women used to lighten their faces. Many of these powders contained arsenic as well. Women applied them daily, believing it made their skin smooth and pale. Instead, the chemicals caused burns, irritation, and long-term damage. Yet sellers continued to market them, and customers continued to buy. It is almost laughable that people trusted products that made their skin peel, as if that were a sign of beauty. But such faith was common in that period. Workshops and factories that produced arsenic-based products were also unsafe. Workers handled pigments directly, breathing in dust that settled on their clothes and skin. Many grew sick but had little choice but to keep working. Wages were low, and safety measures were almost non-existent. The industry thrived because the demand never slowed, and so the cycle of production and poisoning continued without interruption. In the evenings, families gathered in their decorated rooms. A husband read his newspaper, a wife sewed by candlelight, and children played nearby. None of them knew that the flakes of wallpaper falling with each movement of air carried poison into their bodies. The danger was not obvious, so it was ignored. Illness was already common in crowded cities. So few suspected that the walls themselves added to the problem. When compared to modern standards, It would be as if people today filled their living rooms with paint made of pesticides and then wondered why their children became sick. The difference is that today, regulations exist to stop such things, while in Victorian times, the market decided what was safe. Reports did surface. Doctors sometimes noted clusters of illness in homes with certain wallpapers. Newspapers published warnings, but they did not spread widely. Manufacturers denied responsibility, claiming the products were safe when used correctly. Shopkeepers did not want to lose sales, so they downplayed any concerns. Families continued buying what was available. Few were willing to spend more money on plainer designs when brighter ones seemed affordable and fashionable. Inside poor neighbourhoods, the risks were even greater. Ventilation was bad, and damp air caused the wallpaper to release more particles. Families crowded into small rooms, breathing in the toxins with every breath. Children coughed through the night, mothers felt constant fatigue, and fathers returned from work to sit in poisoned air. Yet they considered it normal. Poverty left them with little power to demand change. Some reformers tried to act. Chemists published warnings about arsenic. A few doctors linked deaths to the dyes. Campaigners spoke of the risks, but they were not strong enough to overcome public demand. The government hesitated to interfere in trade. As a result, change came very slowly. People suffered for decades before regulations began to take hold. By then, countless lives had already been shortened. Museums today keep samples of Victorian wallpaper in storage. When tested, these papers still release measurable arsenic. Curators wear gloves when handling them, careful not to disturb the surfaces. What was once decoration is now treated as a hazardous object. The patterns remain striking, showing how appealing the designs were, but the knowledge of their danger has changed how they are seen. What Victorians embraced as fashion, we now recognise as poison. The story of arsenic in Victorian life shows how easily danger can be accepted when it is disguised as progress. Families decorated their homes, bought gowns, and applied powders without knowing that these choices harmed them. Sellers focused on profit, customers on appearance, and authorities on stability. Safety was not the priority. Illness and death were the cost of keeping up with fashion. I find it disturbing to picture children sleeping in rooms covered with poison while their parents thought they had given them comfort. Arsenic was not hidden in secret factories. It was visible in markets, homes, and faces every day. People simply did not question it. That makes its presence more frightening, because it was accepted as ordinary. What looked like refinement was actually decay, and the cost of beauty was measured in suffering. The presence of arsenic in wallpaper, clothing, and cosmetics shows how beauty in Victorian times often came at the expense of health. Yet while poison in the home was deadly, the workplace carried its own hidden dangers. In the hat-making trade, mercury quietly destroyed minds and bodies, leaving behind the phrase "mad as a hatter." Hat-making in Victorian times was a respected craft. Hats were essential to fashion for both men and women, and workshops produced them in large numbers. The process looked ordinary from the outside. Workers cut felt, shaped it, and added decorations. Customers saw fine hats in shop windows and admired their style. What they did not see was the substance used behind the scenes to soften the animal fur that formed the basis of many hats. That substance was mercury, and it slowly poisoned the people who handled it every day. Fur from rabbits and other animals needed to be treated before it could be shaped. Mercury nitrate was used to make the fibres softer and easier to press into form. The liquid soaked into the material, and when heated during shaping, it released vapours into the air. Hatters bent over their work tables for long hours, breathing those fumes without protection. Over time, their bodies absorbed the mercury, and the effects appeared gradually. At first, it was only small changes, but the damage grew worse as the years passed. The symptoms became visible to anyone who spent time around these workers. Their hands shook when they tried to hold tools. They grew anxious and had sudden mood swings. Memory slipped, words became confused, and thoughts scattered. Some began to suffer from hallucinations, hearing sounds that were not there or seeing things others did not see. Families noticed changes in personality, but there was little understanding of the cause. People simply believed that hatters were odd or unstable by nature. It is grimly ironic that society laughed at their strange behaviour, while ignoring that it was the industry itself that destroyed them. Doctors sometimes called it hatter's shakes or erethism. The name carried a sense of recognition, but not much sympathy. Once a worker showed clear signs of mercury poisoning, their career often ended. They could no longer work with precision, and employers dismissed them. Poverty followed quickly, and many hatters died in miserable conditions. The industry continued, because as long as fashion demanded hats, workers could be replaced by new ones willing to take the risk. Mercury remained essential to the process, and alternatives were not pursued seriously until much later. Workshops were poorly ventilated, windows were kept closed in cold weather, and fires heated the rooms. The vapours thickened in the air, invisible but deadly. Hats were steamed, brushed, and pressed, releasing more mercury at every step. Workers wore no protection, and the dust settled on their skin and clothing. They carried the poison home to their families. Children and spouses often developed unexplained illnesses simply by living near the work, but the connection was rarely made, and families suffered quietly. From a modern perspective, this looks like a clear case of occupational poisoning. It would be as if today's factory workers were knowingly exposed to toxic chemicals without masks or ventilation, and employers dismissed their illness as weakness. The difference is that modern regulation forces industries to consider safety, while Victorian times left workers to handle the cost themselves. Some hatters tried to hide their symptoms as long as possible. Shaking hands could be blamed on fatigue, mood swings, or stress, but the damage progressed. Nervous systems weakened, speech slurred, and hallucinations grew worse. Once a man was marked as unstable, it followed him. Neighbours whispered, employers avoided him, and doctors offered little help. There was no cure for mercury poisoning. Once it took hold, it only worsened until death. Newspapers occasionally mentioned the strange behaviour of hatters. Jokes spread about their eccentric ways. The phrase "mad as a hatter" became common, repeated casually without thought of its origin. Behind the humour was a deadly truth. Each mad hatter was a victim of long-term exposure to mercury. But in a society that valued fashion over labourers, their suffering was not enough to spark reform. The industry carried on, selling hats that symbolised respectability while destroying the people who made them. The economic demand for hats kept pressure on workers. A well-made hat was not a luxury, but a necessity in public life. Men wore them daily, and women's fashion demanded elaborate designs. Every style, from top hats to bonnets, passed through the hands of hatters exposed to mercury. Customers never questioned how their goods were made. The appearance of quality mattered more than the health of the craftsman. I cannot help but think of the silence that must have filled those workshops, broken only by coughing and the sound of tools, while men slowly lost their minds at the tables where they worked. The cycle continued for decades. Only later in the century did awareness grow enough to consider alternatives. Even then, change was slow. Industries resisted because mercury was effective, and new methods cost more. Workers remained expendable in the eyes of employers. Lives could be replaced, but profit could not be sacrificed. This mindset ensured that many more hatters endured years of suffering before regulations eventually reduced the use of mercury. Looking back, the story of hatters is another reminder of how progress in appearance often masked destruction behind the scenes. Customers admired the shine of hats, unaware of the toll it took on those who made them. Employers denied responsibility, and authorities hesitated to act. Hatters themselves carried the burden, their health sacrificed for the sake of style. Their decline became entertainment for others, a cruel twist that added insult to their injuries. Mercury poisoning was not a secret in hidden corners. It was visible in the trembling hands, confused speech, and sudden outbursts of countless workers. Yet society treated it as a joke. This indifference made the tragedy even heavier. It was not only mercury that poisoned these men, but also the neglect of a culture that valued hats more than human life. The suffering of hatters was the result of years of breathing in mercury, leaving them weak in body and broken in mind. Fashion demanded hats, but the price was paid by the men who made them. In the orphanages of Victorian England, another price was paid in silence. As children disappeared and no one asked where they had gone. Orphanages in Victorian England were presented as places of care and shelter. Families too poor to raise children brought them there, and abandoned infants were left at the doors. From the outside, the buildings appeared orderly, with uniforms, routines, and discipline. Visitors sometimes saw rows of children sitting quietly, heads bowed, and believed that they were being taught and protected. In reality, many orphanages functioned as holding places where children were prepared for labour rather than nurtured for a future. Their lives were treated as resources to be used, not as individuals with needs. Institutions arranged agreements with factories, farms, and workshops. Children were taken away in groups under the label of apprenticeships. On paper, this looked like training for a trade, but in truth, it was often a one-way journey. The children were carried to distant towns or rural areas, far from anyone who might ask after them. There were no proper records, no promises of return, and no oversight. Once they left the gates, they were no longer visible to society. Families who had surrendered them rarely had the means or the right to question where they had gone. The work given to these orphans was harsh. Some were sent to mines where they crawled through tunnels too small for adults. Others worked in textile mills, tending dangerous machines that tore at their small fingers. Agricultural labour demanded long hours in fields under rain or sun. Conditions were exhausting, food was meagre, and beatings were common. The apprenticeships were described as opportunities, but the reality was closer to exile. It is almost bitterly comical that official documents describe these transfers as charity, when in fact they were organised abandonment. The disappearance of orphans was made easier by the lack of paperwork. Birth certificates were rare, and many children had no clear record of their existence. Once they were placed in institutions, their names might change, or their histories might be lost. When they left, there was no trail to follow. To question the process was to challenge established authority, and most people did not dare. Silence was the rule. It protected the institutions, the employers, and even the wider society that preferred not to confront the truth. The children themselves had little chance of escape. They were young, unfamiliar with the places where they were sent, and often too far from cities to seek help. Many simply faded into the background of rural labour or industrial work. Some died of accidents, disease, or neglect, their graves unmarked and their names forgotten. Their absence raised no alarm because absence was expected. Once a child was gone, it was assumed they had been placed somewhere useful, and that was enough for those in charge. Authorities defended the practice by calling it necessary. Orphanages were overcrowded, resources were limited, and the economy always demanded more workers. Sending children away seemed practical. Employers wanted cheap labour, institutions wanted fewer mouths to feed, and society wanted to believe the problem of orphans had been solved. The arrangement satisfied everyone except the children, whose voices were never heard. When viewed through today's lens, it would be like taking children from shelters and delivering them directly to dangerous factories. While calling it an educational program, reports occasionally surfaced of cruelty. Some inspectors noted the conditions in which apprentices lived, recording long hours, starvation, and punishment. Charitable groups tried to raise awareness, but these efforts rarely changed the system. Institutions promised reform but continued as before. Public opinion was often indifferent, and scandals were forgotten quickly. The cycle repeated, and more children vanished into labour every year. Inside the orphanages, the atmosphere prepared children for obedience. Strict rules, physical punishment, and constant reminders of their dependence broke down resistance. The children were taught that leaving was their fate, and few dared to question it. They accepted that one day a wagon would arrive, they would be loaded with their belongings, and they might never see the institution again. To them, it was not a shocking event but an expected step. That normalization made the system even harder to challenge. The most disturbing element was the legality. Nothing about this process was hidden from the law. Agreements were signed openly, and officials approved them. Employers were not punished, and orphanages were not condemned. The practice was part of the accepted order. I cannot stop thinking about how many children walked out of those doors and were never spoken of again, as if their lives had no more weight than tools carried away for work. The lack of public outrage reflected broader attitudes toward poverty. Orphans were seen as burdens, reminders of social failure that people preferred not to face. By sending them away, institutions removed the visible problem. Communities could believe they had done their duty, while the reality was simply the relocation of suffering. It was easier to erase the children than to improve their lives. This logic made the practice endure for decades. Even when rare investigations uncovered shocking conditions, they seldom led to change. Reports might stir temporary sympathy, but political will was weak. Employers had power, institutions had authority, and the orphans themselves had no voice. Reformers fought for better oversight, but progress came slowly. Long after, thousands of children had disappeared into lives of hardship. Many of those lives ended early, leaving little trace behind. Looking back, the story of the missing orphans is a reminder of how silence can protect injustice. The system operated in plain sight, and everyone knew children were being sent away. Yet no one asked where they went, how they lived, or whether they survived. The tragedy was not only the suffering of the children, but the collective decision of society to turn away. In the end, the disappearance of orphans was not a secret at all. It was an open practice hidden by indifference. The reality of orphanages in Victorian England was not care, but transfer. They took in children and passed them along, as if lives could be traded for convenience. The quiet that followed was the true measure of how deeply society accepted their disappearance. The use of mercury destroyed hatters slowly, but the orphanages erased children entirely. Behind closed doors, they were loaded onto carts and sent away, and most never returned. In the dark alleys of the city, another trade thrived at night, where bodies were stolen from graves to meet the hunger of medical schools. In Victorian England, graveyards were crowded, and funerals for the poor were often simple and quick. Families buried their loved ones in shallow graves, marked by little more than a wooden cross or a mound of soil. The dead were placed in thin coffins, sometimes made of cheap wood that broke down quickly in damp ground. For the poor, there was comfort only in knowing the burial had taken place at all, yet even that peace was not guaranteed. Once night fell, the cemeteries became targets for men who made their living stealing the dead. These men were known as resurrectionists, or resurrection men. Their work was not to rob valuables, but to take the bodies themselves. Medical schools and hospitals demanded fresh cadavers for teaching and research. Students needed bodies to practice dissection, and doctors wanted specimens for study. Laws provided very few legal ways to obtain them. The only official sources were executed criminals, but executions were not common enough to meet the need. As a result, resurrection men filled the gap. They dug up the newly buried, pulled the bodies from their coffins, and sold them to institutions eager to pay. The work was crude but efficient. A team could uncover a coffin in less than an hour. They opened the lid, dragged the body out, and refilled the grave to hide the disturbance. Often, they stripped the clothes and left them behind, since stealing possessions counted as theft, while taking the body itself did not always lead to prosecution. The body was carried away in a sack or cart under the cover of darkness. By morning, it might already be on a dissecting table in a medical theatre. It is almost ridiculous that the law treated a dead person as property only when clothes or jewellery were taken, but not when the entire body was removed. The families of the poor were the most frequent victims. Their graves were easiest to reach, and there were fewer guards to prevent intrusion. Wealthier families protected their dead with heavy stone tombs, iron bars, or guards who watched for weeks after burial. In some cemeteries, cages called mortsafes were placed over graves to keep thieves away. Poor families could not afford such protection. Their loved ones lay in vulnerable plots, where a single night of neglect meant their bodies could vanish forever. The trade in corpses was no secret to those in medicine. Doctors and students knew the origins of the bodies, but most chose not to question it. The teaching of anatomy depended on a steady supply, and resurrection men provided it. Hospitals paid in cash, no questions asked. To the medical profession, the end justified the means. They claimed the knowledge gained would save lives. For the families who found empty graves, the argument meant little. Their grief was doubled by the violation of the burial they had struggled to provide. Cemeteries began to resemble guarded compounds. Watchmen patrolled the grounds at night. Towers were built so guards could survey large areas. Families sometimes kept watch themselves, staying at graves for days to ensure the body remained undisturbed. Fires were lit, dogs were kept nearby, and weapons were carried for protection. Despite these measures, resurrection men often found ways to slip in, bribing guards or working in remote corners where no one watched. The fear was constant, and burial became not an act of rest but a gamble against theft. From today's perspective, the situation feels both shocking and systematic. It would be as if hospitals now allowed unlicensed collectors to raid morgues and bring bodies for teaching, all while pretending not to notice the origins. The difference is that modern regulations ensure legal donation, while Victorian times left the supply to the black market. The result was a steady trade in human remains that fed education while terrorising the poor. The resurrection men themselves often lived rough lives. They were seen as criminals, but also as necessary suppliers. Their work paid better than many honest trades, though it carried risks of arrest or violence. Communities hated them, and if caught, they could be beaten by mobs. Yet the demand for bodies was strong enough to keep them in business. No matter how many were caught, others were ready to take their place. Profit outweighed fear, as it so often did in the Victorian age. Reports of grave robbing appeared in newspapers, causing public outrage. Families expressed horror, but the protests rarely led to change. Officials argued that without bodies, medical science could not progress. Reformers demanded alternatives, but legal change was slow. It was only with the Anatomy Act of 1832, which allowed unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals to be used for dissection, that the trade finally declined. By then, the damage had already been done. Countless graves had been emptied, and trust in burial had been shattered. For the poor, the violation lingered as a bitter memory. Funerals had been their last act of dignity, and even that was stolen. Mothers, fathers, and children were taken from their resting places, dissected by strangers, and discarded without ceremony. The sorrow could not be measured only in the loss of the body, but in the loss of peace. To be poor in Victorian England meant not only hardship in life, but insecurity in death. I often think about how terrifying it must have been for families to walk into a cemetery and wonder if the grave they had filled was still holding the person they had buried. That constant doubt turned mourning into suspicion and grief into fear. Death, which should have brought an end to suffering, instead opened a new door to violation. The resurrection men were not just thieves of bodies, but thieves of closure, robbing families of the one comfort they thought remained. The story of grave robbing in Victorian times is not simply about crime, but about the gap between progress and protection. Medical schools advanced, but poor families paid the price. Knowledge grew, but respect for the dead declined. In the rush to dissect and learn, dignity was forgotten. The graveyards of England became hunting grounds, and silence covered the pain of those left behind. The trade in corpses showed how far society would go to serve science while ignoring the dignity of its poorest members. Guards patrolled, families prayed, and thieves continued their work, each group trapped in the same grim cycle. The disappearance of orphans had already revealed how the vulnerable could be erased without protest. Now even the dead were taken, stripped of rest, and turned into lessons for students. In the medicine shops of the city, another poison was sold freely, one that mothers and children consumed without fear, and its name was laudanum. Laudanum was one of the most common substances in Victorian households. Sold openly in apothecaries, it was a mixture of alcohol and opium, placed in small bottles with simple labels. Anyone could buy it, from the wealthy lady in her carriage to the working mother counting coins. There were no restrictions, no prescriptions, and no warnings. To many, it was not a dangerous drug but an ordinary remedy. It was taken for headaches, toothaches, stomach cramps, and sleepless nights. It was also given to children, sometimes only to keep them quiet. Laudanum was not a hidden poison, but a trusted part of daily life. Apothecaries displayed rows of bottles on their shelves. Customers asked for laudanum as casually as they asked for tea or bread. The cost was low enough for most to afford, and the demand never slowed. It was recommended for nervous conditions, for coughs, and for pain after childbirth. In pamphlets and advertisements, it was described as soothing and reliable. Few questioned its ingredients, and fewer still understood the risks. It is almost laughable that society treated laudanum like a household spice when, in reality, it was opium dissolved in alcohol. Mothers often used it with infants. A few drops in a bottle of milk or water made the baby fall asleep quickly. For exhausted parents, it seemed like a gift. A crying child could be silenced, a restless night avoided. But the small bodies of children could not handle the strength of the drug. Some never woke again. Death certificates might list weakness, convulsions, or unknown causes, but rarely the true reason. The practice continued, not out of malice, but out of ignorance and desperation. Sleep for the parent came at the cost of life for the child. Adults became dependent as well. Laudanum dulled pain and eased anxiety, but it also created tolerance. Doses had to increase over time. Women suffering from menstrual cramps or depression took it regularly. Men working long hours or carrying injuries relied on it too. Addiction was not a word they used, but the signs were clear. People became pale, thin, and sluggish, with hollow eyes and trembling hands. Yet apothecaries kept selling, and customers kept buying. The cycle repeated in every district of the city. The effects spread quietly through society. Writers, poets, and even politicians used laudanum, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret. It was said to inspire creativity or relieve strain, but it also ruined lives, breaking families and ending careers. Dependence was treated as weakness rather than illness. No one blamed the sellers, and the buyers blamed themselves. Looking at this through a modern lens, it would be like buying bottles of pure morphine at the corner shop, advertised as harmless medicine for the whole family. The bottles were small, but the impact was enormous. Inside homes, laudanum sat beside bread, sugar, and tea, part of the daily cabinet. Children grew up seeing it as ordinary. They watched their mothers take it in teaspoons, sometimes mixed with water, sometimes swallowed straight. They learned that a few drops could solve problems, not knowing it created new ones. Addiction passed quietly through generations, disguised as medicine. Doctors were slow to act. Many prescribed laudanum themselves, believing it useful. They saw it calm patients and relieve pain, and they did not want to take away something that seemed effective. There was little understanding of long-term harm. Official warnings were rare, and enforcement was weaker still. For decades, the drug spread without barriers. Only when deaths became too numerous and too visible did serious discussions about regulation begin. Inside poor neighbourhoods, the reliance was even greater. Labourers used it to numb injuries, mothers to silence hunger pangs, and the sick to dull endless pain. It was cheaper than a doctor and easier to obtain than proper food. In dimly lit rooms, families shared doses, passing the bottle around as if it were part of a meal. The relief was brief, but for people living hard lives, even a few hours of rest felt worth the risk. I cannot stop picturing a mother rocking her baby to sleep with laudanum in the milk, believing she was giving comfort, not realizing she was giving death. Laudanum shaped daily rhythms. It put babies to sleep, soothed the elderly, and filled the nights of countless homes. It blurred the lines between medicine and poison. The tragedy was not only in the deaths but in the acceptance. Society knew it was dangerous, but continued to use it because the alternative felt harder. Pain was constant, life was harsh, and laudanum was easy. That simplicity kept the bottles on shelves and the trade alive. Over time, reformers began to speak against it. Reports of child deaths and ruined lives spread in newspapers. Campaigners pushed for restrictions, but they faced resistance from apothecaries and manufacturers. The trade was profitable, and many feared losing a reliable remedy. Laws were eventually passed to limit access, but not before countless lives were affected. By then, laudanum had already left its mark on an entire generation. The story of laudanum is not just about a drug, but about trust. People trusted apothecaries, advertisements, and even doctors. They trusted that what was sold openly must be safe. That trust was betrayed by ignorance and profit. Laudanum became a symbol of how easily harm can hide in plain sight, disguised as care. Its bottles were small, but their shadow was long. Laudanum was bought and swallowed like candy, its dangers hidden behind everyday habit. Children were silenced with drops that ended their cries forever, while adults carried bottles that slowly consumed their lives. In the cemeteries already threatened by grave robbers, new bodies arrived each day, not stolen from the ground but delivered by the very medicine that claimed to heal. For many poor families in Victorian England, a funeral was more than they could afford. The cost of a coffin, a grave plot, and a simple ceremony quickly added up to sums far beyond the reach of workers who barely earned enough to eat. When death came, which it often did in crowded, disease-filled neighbourhoods, families sometimes had no choice but to turn to the authorities. Instead of arranging a private burial, they accepted what was called a pauper's funeral. It was meant to provide dignity to those who had nothing, but in truth, it often meant losing control over the body of the deceased. The system handled these bodies in ways that families rarely understood. Some were buried in mass graves, coffins stacked one upon another with no markers or names. Others were sent quietly to medical schools, where they became material for dissection. Hospitals and training centres needed cadavers, and the law allowed them to use the unclaimed dead or the bodies of those whose relatives could not pay. To the authorities, this was efficient. To the families, it was a quiet betrayal. They thought their loved ones had been laid to rest, when in reality the body had been taken away. Medical students learned their craft on these bodies. They cut into the flesh, studied the organs, and practiced their skills without consent. The families were never asked for permission. The bodies were treated as resources, stripped of identity the moment they were claimed by the state. It is hard not to find a grim irony in the fact that while the living poor were denied healthcare, their dead bodies were given freely to trained doctors. In some cases, bodies were not even used for teaching but for crude experiments. Compounds and treatments were tested on the dead without oversight. Parts were cut away, burned, or dissolved in chemicals. Once the use was finished, the remains were disposed of, often without ceremony, sometimes even burned in groups. The dignity that families imagined was rarely provided. To the institutions, these were not husbands, wives, or children. They were material, anonymous, and replaceable. The practice was not kept secret. Yet it was not widely spoken of either. The poor had little power to resist, and questioning the system brought no change. Complaints were ignored, and the cost of a private funeral was still too high for most. The silence of poverty protected the authorities. People whispered about what might have happened to their relatives, but they had no proof and no means to fight back. From a modern perspective, it would be like hospitals today quietly diverting unclaimed patients to laboratories without telling the families, all under the cover of efficiency. The few who did challenge the system faced indifference. Officials argued that it was better for the bodies to be used than wasted. They insisted that medical progress required sacrifices, and the poor could not expect the same rights as the wealthy. After all, the rich had the means to secure private burials, stone tombs, and guarded cemeteries. The poor had none of that. They depended on charity, and charity came with conditions. Those conditions included the loss of control over the fate of the body. Stories circulated of relatives who visited cemeteries only to discover no record of a burial. Others found mass graves where names were missing or misplaced. Rumours of bodies sent to school spread fear, but people continued to accept paupers' funerals because there was no other option. Each new death reminded families of their helplessness. They could choose to feed the living or to bury the dead. Most chose survival, even if it meant surrendering the body to the state. Institutions treated this as routine. The paperwork was simple, the transfers efficient, and the demand constant. Doctors and students relied on the steady flow of bodies, and governments relied on the savings. No one asked whether it was right. In life, the poor were tools of industry. In death, they became tools of science. The pattern was the same, and it left no room for dignity. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine a grieving family walking away from what they thought was a burial, not realizing that their loved one had already been sent to a dissecting room or a furnace. The contrast between their sorrow and the reality is one of the most disturbing truths of the era. It was not only poverty that killed, but poverty that followed into death, stripping away even the last right to rest. The pauper's funeral became a symbol of inequality. The rich could buy peace for their dead, but the poor could not. The graveyards themselves reflected this divide, with ornate headstones for some and unmarked pits for others. The system reinforced the message that wealth determined not only how one lived, but also how one was remembered. For the poor, memory was fragile, and bodies were disposable. By the time reforms were discussed, the damage had already been done. Thousands of bodies had been diverted, dissected, or burned without ceremony. Families never knew the truth. They mourned, they prayed, but they never saw the graves they imagined. The silence lasted generations, passed down as whispers of fear and suspicion. What had been presented as charity was in reality another way of using the poor. The story of pauper burials is a reminder of how deeply poverty shaped every part of Victorian life. It stripped people of choices, dignity, and even the peace of death. The poor could not protest, and the powerful saw no reason to change. To the state, bodies were a problem to be managed. To families, they were loved ones. Between those two realities lay a gulf that was never closed. Families who trusted the system often discovered too late that their loved ones had not been buried at all. The promise of rest had been broken, and the bodies were gone forever, in elegant houses. Meanwhile, women seeking beauty faced dangers of their own, dying from the very cosmetics and dyes that were meant to make them shine. In the homes of the wealthy, beauty was treated as both a duty and a standard. Women of a noble family spent hours preparing their appearance, from their gowns to their hair. Hair dye was especially fashionable, promising to restore youth or change one's look to match the latest styles. Bottles filled with liquid mixtures were bought from chemists or travelling sellers. Labels often claimed miraculous results, but the real contents were far more dangerous. Many of these dyes contained lead and nitrate of silver, chemicals that slowly poisoned the women who used them. The process began with excitement. A servant applied the liquid, combing it through the hair and covering the scalp. The mixture stung the skin, leaving redness that some considered normal. Over time, the irritation grew worse. The scalp developed sores, and hair fell out in clumps. Yet women continued to use the product because fashion demanded it. No one wanted to appear old or plain. Complaints were brushed aside as temporary discomfort, not warning signs of something fatal. Symptoms spread beyond the hair. Lead seeped into the bloodstream, causing weakness, tremors, and confusion. Women suffered from dizziness and fainting spells during social gatherings. At home, they experienced violent cramps, vomiting, and seizures. These episodes were often hidden from outsiders. Families described them as nervous conditions, and doctors sometimes recorded them as hysteria or mental illness. It is almost absurd that seizures caused by toxic chemicals were dismissed as emotional weakness, but such was the logic of the time. Behind closed doors, the suffering grew worse. Women collapsed in their bedrooms. Gowns spread around them, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. Servants carried them to their beds, not knowing how to help. Some died within hours, their deaths recorded vaguely as illness or exhaustion. Others lingered, slowly wasting away until their organs failed. These women were not treated as victims of poison, but as unfortunate cases of fragile health. The truth remained buried beneath social expectations. The danger was not limited to hair dye. Cosmetics used to lighten the skin contained similar compounds. Powders with mercury or lead promised a pale complexion, but they burned the skin and damaged internal organs when absorbed. Lotions and creams often included metals that created long-term harm. The pursuit of beauty, guided by fashion and profit, left women exposed to risks that no one fully acknowledged. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like buying skincare products today that contained battery acid, sold freely without warnings, and praised in magazines as must-have items. Doctors rarely challenged these practices. Some even recommended the products, unaware of their dangers. Medical knowledge was limited, and the link between chemicals and symptoms was not clear. Women themselves often accepted the suffering as part of their duty to look graceful. They valued appearance because society demanded it. A woman's worth was judged not by her health, but by how she looked at dinners, balls, and public events. To abandon these treatments would mean ridicule or exclusion. In grand houses, mirrors reflected women who smiled through pain. They hid their sores beneath powder, pinned their thinning hair carefully, and wore gowns that concealed their weakness. Servants whispered about the illnesses, but their voices carried no weight. Families focused on maintaining appearances, even when it meant ignoring the obvious. The women themselves continued the rituals, unable to step outside the expectations that bound them. The poison became a daily routine, accepted without question. The deaths were quiet but numerous. Records of young women who died of so-called nervous diseases filled the registries. Their names faded quickly, replaced by others who followed the same path. The cycle was constant. Beauty products promised more, women bought them, and the suffering continued. The industry faced no punishment because the women were seen as willing participants. Their deaths were viewed as misfortune, not injustice. I find it chilling to imagine a ballroom filled with glowing dresses and smiling faces, knowing that many of those women were slowly being killed by the very products that gave them their shine. The pattern of silence was familiar. Just as orphans disappeared without protest and graves were robbed without justice, the poisoning of women was hidden beneath normalcy. Society pretended it was natural for women to faint, to be delicate, or to lose strength. The real cause was rarely admitted. Poison was rebranded as elegance, and its victims were blamed for their own fragility. Fashion dictated sacrifice, and sacrifice became invisible. Only later did reformers begin to speak of chemical dangers. By then, countless women had already suffered. New products eventually replaced the most dangerous ones, but change was slow. The pursuit of beauty continued to carry risks, even as knowledge improved. The legacy of those poisons remains a reminder of how often profit was placed above safety. The women who died were not remembered for their suffering, but for the gowns they wore and the roles they played in society. The story of hair dyes and cosmetics in Victorian England is not just about chemicals, but about the weight of expectation. Women were pressured to appear perfect, and they paid with their health. Their deaths were recorded as nervous conditions, not as the result of toxins. The truth was hidden behind social norms, leaving their suffering largely forgotten. It was one more example of how appearance mattered more than life itself in that era. The poisons in hair dyes and cosmetics left women shaking in their rooms, their deaths explained away as weakness rather than truth. Their fate was another reminder that beauty and danger were often the same in Victorian life. In the world outside those grand houses, young women faced a different kind of threat, where pregnancies before marriage led not to poison, but to banishment and silence. In Victorian society, marriage was not simply a private matter. It was a public contract that tied families together, secured property, and preserved reputations. A young woman who became pregnant before her wedding risked bringing shame not only on herself, but on her entire family. The response to such a scandal was often swift and merciless. Instead of facing gossip or disgrace, families sometimes chose to remove the woman from view entirely. She would be sent away to a convent or an institution, described as a place of treatment, though it was more a prison than a refuge. These convents or retreats accepted young women under the justification of care. Families signed papers, handed over their daughters, and expected silence in return. Once inside, the women were cut off from the outside world. Their names might be removed from family records, and relatives were told not to mention them again. For the family, this erased the shame. For the woman, it meant the end of her identity. She was hidden away, her life reshaped by walls and rules she had no power to resist. The daily life in these institutions was harsh. Women rose early, attended prayers, and performed chores. Contact with the outside world was limited or forbidden. Letters were censored, and visits were rare. Some women gave birth in secrecy, their children taken away immediately. Others were kept for years, with no promise of release. The silence surrounding their confinement ensured that few people asked questions. Society preferred to believe that the problem had been solved. It is almost bitter to think that families believed erasing a name from their records was the same as erasing the reality of a life. Not every woman survived these places. Some died in childbirth without care, their graves left unmarked behind chapels. Others withered away from illness or despair. Even those who lived often emerged broken, unfit to return to ordinary life. Families rarely welcomed them back. Instead, they were remembered as absent, as if they had never existed. Their absence became part of family history, not spoken of but understood in silence. The women who disappeared into convents were not criminals. Their only fault was carrying a child without the protection of marriage. Yet society treated them as if they had committed unforgivable sins. Respectability was considered more important than compassion. The rules of appearance weighed heavily than the reality of suffering. In many cases, men who caused the pregnancies faced no consequence at all. The burden fell entirely on the women, who were punished by erasure. From a modern viewpoint, this practice seems cruel and calculated. It would be like sending a young woman today into isolation because she embarrassed her family, locking her away until she was no longer a problem. The difference is that Victorian society accepted this as natural, even necessary. Silence was seen as the proper solution, and the lives lost to it were never counted. Inside the convents, the atmosphere was one of restraint. Women moved in groups, spoke only when allowed, and followed rigid schedules. The air was heavy with prayers, but comfort was scarce. Some resigned themselves to the rules, while others resisted quietly, though resistance brought punishment. Hope faded quickly in such an environment. The walls that confined them became the horizon of their lives. The world outside went on, and they were forgotten. Records of these women are rare. Families destroyed documents, and institutions kept their ledgers closed. A few cases surfaced in newspapers, usually when the scandal could not be contained. Reports spoke of women buried in convent grounds, their deaths hidden from the public. Even then, society reacted with little more than passing interest. The silence remained the strongest shield for those in power. Families were relieved, institutions continued their work, and the women themselves disappeared into history. I cannot help but think of the chilling quiet in those convent halls, where women walked with bowed heads, each one carrying a story that would never be told outside those walls. Their lives were not measured by their hopes or talents, but by their failure to meet an impossible expectation. The cruelty lay not only in confinement, but in the deliberate decision to erase them, to treat them as problems rather than people. The pattern of erasure stretched across the era. Orphans were sent away, graves were emptied, and now daughters were hidden when they did not conform. Each story carried the same theme: silence used as a weapon. Victorian society prized order, but the price of that order was human lives pushed out of sight. The polished image of respectability rested on the suffering of those who were made invisible. These forced confinements left scars that extended beyond the women themselves. Families learned to keep secrets, to hide shame, and to rewrite their histories. Generations later, traces of missing women remain only in whispers or unexplained absences in records. The truth rarely surfaces, and when it does, it shocks by its cruelty. The fact that it happened so often shows how deeply society valued appearances over compassion. The women sent away to convents never had weddings, never had public futures, and often never returned. Their lives ended in silence, erased from memory by the people who should have protected them. The rules of the time made them vanish without a fight. The women who died from poison carried the weight of beauty, while these women carried the weight of shame. Both were victims of a society that placed appearance above life. Beyond these tragedies, another secret waited in the walls of Victorian houses, where the remains of infants were hidden, leaving behind discoveries that horrified later generations. When old Victorian houses were demolished or renovated, workers sometimes uncovered small bundles hidden behind fireplaces or within the walls. Inside the cloth wrappings were the bodies of infants, long forgotten and never recorded. The discoveries shocked later generations, but in their own time, such things were not entirely rare. These were the silent consequences of desperate choices made in a society that gave women few options and no mercy. Behind respectable doors, secrets were sealed into brick and plaster, left there for decades. Unwanted pregnancies carried severe risks in the Victorian era. Abortion was illegal, and even discussion of it was forbidden. A woman who found herself pregnant outside marriage faced ruin. Her reputation would be destroyed, her family disgraced, and her child labelled illegitimate with little chance of survival. Some women turned to dangerous methods to end pregnancies, using poisons or crude instruments that often killed them as well. Others gave birth in secret, hiding the infants because they could not raise them. For many, the only way to keep silent was to conceal the evidence permanently. The walls of houses became hiding places. A bundle could be placed in a chimney, beneath floorboards, or inside cavities built for fireplaces. Once hidden, the remains were unlikely to be discovered for years. Families moved on, tenants changed, and the secret stayed sealed. When builders finally broke through decades later, the truth came out. By then, the names and stories of the infants were lost. They were simply skeletons, wrapped in cloth that had decayed with time. It is grimly absurd that a society so obsessed with morality created conditions where women felt compelled to hide dead infants inside their own homes. The silence was not just personal, but collective. Neighbours suspected, servants whispered, but no one spoke openly. Everyone knew that discovery would bring scandal and punishment. In many cases, silence was the only form of protection. The link between these hidden bodies and illegal abortion was strong. Abortionists worked in secrecy, often midwives or women with knowledge of herbs. They risked imprisonment if caught, but the demand was constant. Women came to them desperate, seeking escape from shame. Many procedures went wrong, leading to infection or death. When the child was born alive, some women chose to conceal the body afterward, knowing they could never explain its existence. The crime was not only in the act, but in the silence that followed. Authorities rarely pursued these cases. When infant remains were discovered, the explanation was usually recorded vaguely. Sometimes it was blamed on stillbirth, sometimes not recorded at all. Prosecution was rare because evidence was weak and public scandal was unwelcome. The legal system preferred not to ask questions. From a modern perspective, it would be like finding infant bodies in abandoned buildings today and dismissing them as unfortunate but unimportant, without investigation. The refusal to act was itself part of the system. The desperation behind these choices reflected the narrow roles given to women. Marriage was considered their only proper path, and motherhood was tied to respectability. Any deviation brought punishment. A woman pregnant outside marriage risked being sent away, hidden in convents or institutions. As already described, if she tried to survive alone, she faced poverty and disgrace. For many, concealment seemed the only option, no matter how extreme. Their choices were shaped less by cruelty than by the absence of alternatives. Inside the houses where these secrets lay, daily life continued as normal. Families ate meals, children played, and fires burned in hearths behind which a small body rested. Visitors came and went, unaware of what the walls concealed. The contrast between the surface of respectability and the hidden reality was stark. People lived ordinary lives while carrying unspeakable secrets within the very structures of their homes. Builders who discovered the remains years later often spoke of the silence that followed. There were no official inquiries, no attempts to identify the infants. The remains were removed quietly, sometimes reburied, sometimes discarded. The shock of discovery was quickly covered over, much as the infants themselves had been. The system of silence endured, ensuring that the truth remained only in whispers. I cannot stop thinking about the fear that must have driven women to carry small bundles to the darkest corners of their homes, pressing them into cracks and covering them with bricks, knowing that discovery would destroy everything. That fear explains more about Victorian society than any law or record. It was a world where survival often meant concealment, and concealment often meant tragedy. The presence of infant bodies in walls is not only a story of individuals but of a culture. It reflects laws that punished rather than protected, families that valued honour more than compassion, and communities that looked away. The infants were victims of silence as much as of circumstance. Their discovery reminds us that beneath the polished image of Victorian homes lay hidden lives that were never allowed to be lived. These bundles behind fireplaces and walls tell us that morality in that age was often built on denial. The cost was measured in small bodies wrapped in cloth, buried not in graves but in houses meant for the living. The houses stood tall in public, but their bricks carried secrets that could never be spoken aloud. The erased weddings had shown how women were hidden when they broke the rules. The discovery of infants in walls revealed what happened when those rules could not be hidden enough. In the crowded workshops of the city, children faced another deadly burden, working with lead that stained their hands and poisoned their bodies. Printing houses in Victorian cities were filled with noise, paper dust, and the sharp smell of ink. Books, pamphlets, and newspapers rolled out in endless numbers, demanded by a society hungry for information and profit. Behind these products was the labour of children whose small hands were valued more than their well-being. Employers hired boys and girls to clean, type and press machinery, tasks that required fingers nimble enough to reach narrow spaces. To the owners, it was efficient. To the children, it was exhausting and dangerous. Their days were spent surrounded by lead, a substance that entered their bodies slowly but relentlessly. The type used in printing was cast in lead, and every surface carried traces of the metal. Children wiped, scraped, and rubbed the letters to keep them clear of ink. Their bare hands touched the type directly, and dust filled the air. There were no gloves, no ventilation, and no warnings. The work was long, often from dawn until dark, with only short breaks. Food was poor, and the water was dirty. The children grew thinner each week, but the employers cared only that the machines ran smoothly. The effects of lead poisoning soon appeared. At first, the children developed headaches and stomach pains. Their skin grew pale, and they complained of constant fatigue. As exposure continued, the symptoms became severe. Hands trembled, vision blurred, and noses bled without warning. Some children collapsed in seizures, their small bodies unable to handle the poison seeping into them. Blindness was not uncommon, and many never recovered. It is grimly absurd that the same fingers praised for being small enough to clean the type were left crippled by the very work they were hired to do. Employers dismissed these problems as weaknesses. They claimed the children were not strong enough to learn the trade or were too careless. When a child could no longer work, they were sent away with no support. There were always more waiting to take their place, drawn by hunger and the promise of wages. Families accepted the arrangement because they needed the money. Even a few coins a week helped keep food on the table. The cycle of hiring, poisoning, and dismissal continued without pause. Inside the workshops, the air was heavy with particles of lead dust. Every breath carried more of it into the lungs. Clothes became stained, and skin carried a dull grey hue. Children coughed through the day, their voices hoarse and weak. At night, they returned to cramped homes, bringing the dust with them. Siblings and parents often suffered exposure second-hand. The poison spread beyond the walls of the workshop into the lives of entire families. From a modern perspective, the practice is shocking. It would be like employing children today to handle toxic chemicals in factories, praising their small hands while ignoring that the work was destroying them. The fact that it continued openly shows how little value was placed on the lives of the poor. Profit came first, and the children were considered tools, not people. When tools broke, they were discarded. Reformers eventually raised concerns. Reports described children in printing houses who grew sick and blind. Campaigners wrote about the dangers of lead and the cruelty of child labour. But for many years, nothing changed. Employers argued that work built character, and parents continued to send their children because they had no alternatives. Governments hesitated to regulate industries that generated profit. The suffering of children was acknowledged but tolerated. The silence inside the workshops was broken only by the clatter of machines. Children bent over their tasks, too tired to speak. Supervisors walked among them, watching for mistakes. Punishments were harsh for those who slowed down. The children learned quickly to endure pain without complaint. They were reminded daily that weakness was unacceptable, even as their bodies failed under the weight of poison. Some children never made it to adulthood. Their deaths were explained away as illness or natural frailty. Others survived but carried the effects for life, crippled, blind, or too weak to work. Their stories rarely reached the public. They vanished into records as forgotten apprentices, erased from the industries that had consumed them. I cannot help but picture those small hands, once trusted with fragile type, lying still and useless after years of suffering, while the presses continued to print without pause. The story of lead in printing houses was part of a larger pattern. Children were sent into mines, factories, and fields, always chosen for their size and obedience. Their health was sacrificed for the needs of industry. Victorian society celebrated progress, but its progress was built on the backs of children whose lives were cut short. The contradiction was visible to anyone willing to see, yet most chose to look away. Lead dust clung to every page printed in those workshops, a silent reminder of the children who handled the type. Each book and newspaper carried traces of their labour and their pain. Readers never thought of the small hands that had made their words possible. They saw only the finished product, not the cost. The children remained invisible, their suffering hidden behind the appearance of success. The tiny hands of children were stained and broken by lead, their futures taken in silence. Their dismissal was explained as weakness, though the real weakness belonged to the society that allowed it. Beyond the workshops, another danger awaited in the homes of families, where the new technology of gaslighting promised brightness, but instead filled bedrooms with a deadly threat. Gaslighting was celebrated as one of the great advances of Victorian cities. Streets glowed at night, houses were brighter than ever, and businesses could stay open longer. People welcomed the change because it seemed to mark progress. Candles and oil lamps, which had been dim and messy, were replaced by steady flames powered by pipes running beneath the ground. But hidden inside this new convenience was a danger that no one could see or smell. Leaks of gas crept into homes silently, turning bedrooms into chambers of death. The gas used was coal gas, produced in large plants and pumped into homes through metal pipes. It burned cleanly when lit, but when the flow was imperfect or the flame went out, the gas filled the room. It carried no scent and no colour. Families fell asleep with lamps burning or with valves not fully closed, unaware that the air around them was slowly changing. By morning, some never woke again. Their deaths were called sudden or unexplained, though neighbours often whispered about the danger of gas. Leaks were common. Pipes corroded, joints loosened, and valves were poorly maintained. The infrastructure expanded quickly to meet demand, but safety lagged behind. Inspectors were few, and standards were weak. Accidents spread through newspapers, but the trade insisted that gas was safe if used properly. The blame was shifted to careless customers rather than to faulty systems. It is grimly absurd that the same technology praised as bringing light to the poor was also silently suffocating them in their beds. The poor were at the highest risk. Their homes were cramped, with little ventilation. Gas lamps burned through the night because families feared the dark, and leaks spread quickly in closed rooms. Entire households were sometimes found dead in the morning, their windows sealed tight against the cold. Wealthier families had larger homes and more servants to manage the lamps, but even they were not safe. The gas moved silently, indifferent to wealth or status. Doctors recognized the signs of poisoning. Victims were found pale, lips darkened, and bodies stiff in their beds. Survivors who inhaled smaller amounts reported headaches, dizziness, and nausea. But treatment was limited, and prevention was rare. People continued to use gas because the alternative, returning to candles, seemed backward and impractical. The risk was tolerated because convenience was valued more than safety. If we compare it to today, it would be like knowing that household electricity could randomly release poison into the air, yet choosing to keep it because replacing it would cost too much. City officials discussed reforms, but action was slow. Gas companies resisted expensive changes, and governments hesitated to interfere. Accidents were acknowledged but accepted as part of progress. For every family lost, thousands more continued to use the system, unwilling to give up the new light that had transformed their lives. Public anger was not strong enough to force a solution. The poor lacked the power to demand better, and the wealthy accepted the risk as a price of modernity. Inside homes, families carried on as if nothing was wrong. Children played under the glow of lamps, women sewed by steady flames, and men read newspapers after work. The air felt fresh and ordinary, but it was filled with invisible danger. At night, when everyone closed their eyes, the gas gathered quietly. By dawn, silence filled the rooms, broken only when neighbours came knocking. These tragedies repeated themselves, known but unspoken, another hidden truth of Victorian progress. gas lamps became a symbol of contradiction. They represented improvement, yet they caused countless deaths. They illuminated the city, while leaving families in darkness forever. Newspapers reported accidents with restrained tone,